So thank you so much, Atulya, for joining us for another of these conversations about child protection. Um, Obviously, it's a very delicate matter and it's challenging. I can't imagine what it's like to work full time in CPO. I imagine it's quite a harrowing task. Perhaps can begin by you telling us a little bit about your background, how you came to be involved in ISKCON child protection.
Okay. First, thank you for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to share with you and to open the dialogue. So I have a history in community development. So that's what I did at university. And from that, I ended up working in community groups and running community centres and doing a lot of connecting with community, working with youth and with refugee women and children and called women, culturally and linguistically diverse community groups.
Right.
So I was doing that for years, and then when I got married to my husband Keshwar, I moved down to New Nandagram, Hari Krishna Valley, just out of Melbourne. And from there had a bit of a break as I did the transition, and that's when the timing wise, the national executive had mentioned, members had mentioned to me that they're looking for sort of advertising a position as a National Child Protection Officer, and with my background, it kind of really fitted. It was a nice way to sort of bring the experience I have from working with vulnerable community groups and different community groups and policies and things like that, and sort of merging it in a service which was ideal for me. So that's how it sort of came about.
So your role is Australia-wide, is that right?
Correct, yeah, the National Child Protection Officer.
And do you have devotees at various locations that are sort of local agents, so to speak?
Yeah, so under the GBC, so the Child Protection Office laws, it's mandated to have a child protection team at every temple and project within ISKCON. So there's I oversee that that each temple has a team. At least the minimum is two members per temple and project. So most every temple in Australia's got 2 to 3.
And how easy is it to find suitable people with the right kind of background who are able to give it the right kind of time and so on?
Yeah, it can be challenging. It can be challenging because it's a very sensitive area to be working in, and so we try to utilize as much as we can people that have got say whether teaching or some sort of kind of social work background, but that's not that isn't there at every centre. So there's people that even worked in childcare centres but have done as mandated in their own profession, they've done mandated child protection training, so they've got an idea, had a good idea, and are generally interested in working with children's programs and with children within our community. So but yeah, it's not always easy to get people with that professional background that's specific to child protection, but related in some way.
One of the things that's come up quite a bit in these conversations is the need for education of the local community, workshops that. Okay, so I'm recording now and we're back on live, I believe. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, good.
But I think we were talking about education of the local community and that being such a desirable thing to do. How frequently is that possible with the resources available to you? Is it happening in all the Australian temples?
Yeah. So, of course, it is a challenge. As you touched on with Damodar Pundit last week, I mean, funding is always an issue. But in Australia, the National Executive have really stepped up themselves because after the Royal Commission, the landscape of child safety and child protection Australia has really changed quite a bit with responsibilities, particularly, in institutions and religious institutions included, of course. And so, you know, out of their concern, and because in my position, I'm actually I'm a CPO, but I'm also employed by the national executive in Australia, because they're wanting me, and under their role, which, you know, sounds quite conflicting, though they're only interested in their part is making sure that I keep every centre compliant with the child safety laws of that state.
Well, a lot of devotees do express those kind of concerns, don't they? They think if there's any funding coming from ISKCON, then there's a conflict of interest, and it sort of disincentivizes proper investigation. So what are your thoughts about that?
I haven't experienced that in my case. They are completely supportive, 100%. So I can independently, when it comes to cases and issues like that, report and investigate and do what needs to be done. Their concern is, and I report to them in the sense of, you know, where are we at with being, you know, meeting our requirements, because that's in 3 states at this point, Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT, have reportable conduct schemes that have been put in place.
Okay.
And that covers us. We come under that, under those schemes. And in those schemes, then it's the head of the organisation, which would be the temple president, that's the accountable person. So if something isn't being done properly and something goes wrong, they're held accountable. So then, of course, you know, the national executive want to make sure that we're doing everything to be compliant. So that's why they've, you know, engaged put the resources in to having a national CPO, because there's a lot more requirements that are required nowadays, according to state laws, with institution child safety. So then that goes, a lot of my time has gone into developing a new policy. So which is, as Damodar Pundit showed you last week, there's the CPO International Office policies and operational guidelines there. But I've developed the Australian child safety standards, which supplements that policy, which is relevant to the states of Australia.
Okay, because they're all individual federations, the states, right? So each state might have slightly different laws to be applied.
Correct standards on who should have working with children checks. You know, Victoria says all volunteers should. New South Wales says only volunteers that are working directly with children should have a working with children check. So there's different.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You are partly funded by ISKCON Australia.
Correct.
And also some from the international CPO based out of the UK, nothing from there. And we've talked about this, very limited. So it's good that obviously you get some local. Again, we've ended. Don't know what is going on here. I'm going to get us back live again. This is frustrating.
Oh, I hope it's got nothing to do with me. The internet,
No, Arjuna was saying it shouldn't have anything to do with that. I think it's a Zoom issue by the sound of it. Sorry, it just takes me a few mouse clicks before we can go live again. And I hope it's not too frustrating.
I think it's something to do with Facebook, because I've never had it cut out when I was using Restream or YouTube. So you could try doing it on the YouTube channel that I manage.
Let's give it one more go here.
Okay. If not, I can set something up for you on Restream, and then you'd use custom streaming service, and then we'd have to post the link.
If you're happy to have that going on in the background, that may be.
It wouldn't be anything. It wouldn't be done on my computer or anything.
Okay.
I'll just quickly set it up.
It looks like we're live again now.
Okay.
Is that a problem? Anyway. I was going to say, if you can be doing that in the background, it's it's a shame. Okay, Atulya, apologies. So yes, we were talking about funding, and you were saying that yes, you get funded by ISKCON Australia, but you haven't experienced that to create any problems, surfacing issues, and taking the right course of action. It hasn't compromised your ability to operate impartially.
No.
You've been talking quite a bit about this national commission that's taken place in Australia, and it could be that Australia has much more developed policies generally around child protection. So could you tell us a little bit about what this National Commission is, when it came about, what it now requires of participating organisations?
Yeah, okay. So there's a reportable conduct scheme. Is that so? That's current at this point in time in Victoria, New South Wales, and the ACT. So those reportable conduct schemes have been born from the Royal Commission that was run from 2012 to 2017, which was into institutional responses into child sexual abuse. And from that Royal Commission, they gave recommendations, and in the recommendations was born this model for the reportable conduct scheme. And so that is putting, because what they found was a lot of institutions weren't managing child abuse cases properly. They weren't being reported properly, investigated, and dealt with appropriately. So to stop that sort of brushing under the rug, they've developed these reportable conduct schemes, which means that there's this entity. So in New South Wales, it comes under the Guardian of the Children, and then in Victoria, there's the Commission for Children and Young People. So they're state government bodies, and then they oversee. So we're required, say in Victoria, the head of the organisation, as soon as they become aware of an allegation, they have to report that to this commission for the children and young people within 3 business days. And then once they're like that, then we have to follow up with them in a month and advise them where we're going at with the investigation. And if the investigation is complete, we have to give in an investigation report. And then they overlook through that, see if there's any gaps missing, anything that, could be further developed or teased out. And then we give our findings there. So the challenge is there that the current system with the international office is that they want us to go in, investigate, and then send the case to the international office. So you've got all countries all around the world sort of funneling into this one office, for them to then distribute, the cases to look at them and then make a ruling, and whether something's substantiated or unsubstantiated, which is great in theory, on paper, that, and it's good because it keeps the people that are going through and making these decisions, they're not, related or knowing of the people involved. However, under the states in Australia, it's now they want it all dealt with on a local level. So then that makes, there's some changes there with the process according to, the international office policy and what's happening in Australia. So though we still pass the reports on to the international office, but it has to be done in a timely way too, and that's what the governments are wanting. They're wanting it to be dealt with on a local level, thoroughly investigated, and dealt with in a appropriate time, rather than things drawn out, which we know happens, because when you've got so many cases coming into the one place, and then it's time to find the right people to adjudicate on the case. It's a timely process where the governments in Australia are saying, no, it has to be dealt with consistently and get it through, and because for everyone involved, it shouldn't take so long. So then, which is fantastic. So it's holding us.
Our video has ended again. Oh, sorry, Atulya. Don't know what's going on.
I'm used to it down in Hare Krishna Valley. We're always dropping out. So good.
Well, it's such a shame because obviously it's breaking the fluidity of the conversation. So you were talking about the National Commission and how it's been established, and in many ways the local Australian law around these things overrides whatever international CPO policies that we might have in place. But it sounds like international CPO would understand that, and they're still getting notification of what's going on. But obviously the usual appointing of investigators or whatever doesn't necessarily take place.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, because with the international office, they want to research, and receive cases and reports of, allegations and cases that have happened on ISKCON properties, where under the state laws, under especially the reportable conduct schemes, all volunteers. So anyone who's doing a rostered service, if something happens even in their private sphere, so at home, if there's abuse going on there, we have to report that as well. So it's not only
anything that's come to our attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so anything that's come in, it doesn't have to just be in our programs, in our properties, and so, which we know, and Damodar Pundit, touched on that last week, is that majority of abuse is happening in the private sphere, in homes, and especially in Australia, we don't have any children living within ashram, in an ashram system, so all our children are at home living with their families, and so, most, as they know, a high percentage, like 90% of the time, or to 80% of the time, the child actually, it's a carer or an acquaintance of the child that's committing the abuse.
Which
so
reminds
we're now
me,
having to,
sorry, you go.
Sorry.
We're now having to, no, you finish.
So we're now having to report what's going on, which is great, which is giving extra protection to the children within our communities, that if there's something going on in the home, we're also accountable by law to report that as well, and that gets investigated.
Well, and that ties in somewhat with our conversation about education in the community. So I think just before one of our interruptions drop out, you were beginning to talk about that. So do most temples have some kind of annual education program, child appropriate and also for adults?
At this point, it's been so for me to go to each temple, and that was like on every 2 years, but I'm looking at trying to, especially because as we know, to decrease abuse happening within the community, it's all about better prevention through education, awareness, and reporting and a cultural change. And so for that, it's a fantastic question you ask. It's so important, educating and having access to this. So I would like to see it getting done on an annual basis, especially it's difficult with some congregations that are really big. So, for me to go there, I'd have to do numerous to get everyone in, and people are working full time a lot of the time, and then they've got their services, and then I roll into town, and then they're like, oh, now I've got to do this particular training thing on top of others. So I would like to try and, especially in this current climate, see that we try and do a bit more online. We could do online training, because according to the policy, all volunteers, so anyone with a rostered service, should be doing this child safety training, and it goes for 2 hours depending on how many questions. So I've done it through all the temples nationwide, and was supposed to again this year, but COVID had sort of put an interruption into that.
How would you rate the general sort of awareness and I suppose correct attitudinal settings within the community? Are we thinking about this in the right way? Are we still in denial? How would you rate things?
Yeah, it varies. It varies because especially now there's a shift. So some temples have quite a high Indian population there, and so they haven't necessarily had the same places put, structure put into place in their community or social structure, with having child protection, child safety accountability, having to do, working children checks or having to report such things. It's, so different places have different, levels of awareness. People tend to be very open and are quite, I don't think in general there's a real deep understanding of like how broad abuse can be, the emotional effects that on the child and family and community that child abuse can have. People are always horrified when you give them the figures of how many children are actually being reported at being at harm of abuse or being abused. So people aren't, I would say mostly aware of exactly how prevalent and how detrimental the effects of abuse can be on the children and, you know, flowing on to the surrounding community. So there's definitely, you know, need for more awareness raising and more training. At my point, I haven't done any particular child specific, but I've encouraged all the children teachers that are teaching children's classes at all the temples around the country to incorporate that, because it's actually a requirement under the state laws, is to, our policies and procedures need to be child friendly and actually include the ideas from children. They need to be involved in the process.
Right.
So it's not just us imposing, this is what we believe. It needs to be, well, you know, contacting with the children, saying, you know, let's have a discussion. What makes you, you know, to you, what do you think safety means? And opening that dialogue, so then the children can give some feedback to help us change or tweak what our policies and procedures are. So I've encouraged the teachers who are teaching, because that's kind of the best sort of ground I can find, is to get the children in that space. And to be able to have, you know, the right environment for that dialogue, to, you know, have the discussion, because also to, there's, you know, we've developed a code of conduct. So volunteers, rostered volunteers sign that, say that this is the behaviours that they will follow and not partake in. But then, you know, the children also, you know, need to be aware that they also, you know, have to speak up and feel comfortable to speak up and know that they're safe people. So they need to also have some guidance on how to, within our community, you know, address that in what's in a comfortable way for them.
I remember a few years ago, I think it was just after we'd moved to Australia, so it might be as much as 12, 15 years ago, there was some kind of mini-series on the TV called The Smack, and it was dealing with attitudes towards corporal punishment, which of course might also be very different from one nationality to another, from one community to another.
Yeah.
What's your sense of how people are thinking about that nowadays? Does the National Commission have a point of view on corporal punishment?
This is a question that comes up with the training. You know, well, what you know, people are a bit confused. Well, what's the discipline that I can give? You know, and according to policies, you know, with discipline, you can't do you know, anything physically or even emotionally that's going to leave like a longer term effect on a child. You know, so parents are then saying, well, you know, I can't give parenting advice. That's not my role when I, you know, train. All I can give them is, this is what the law states in the guidelines, and do with that. I can't, you know, get into that. But, you know, quite often, you know, there are different situations. Sometimes there's, you know, a tendency, maybe some devotees might want to get really quiet, you know, heavy with their children. You need to study this. You need to memorize slokas. No, we don't want you going out and socializing if there's, you know, boys in the. So then, you know, there's many forms that abuse can take, and if they're being too strict and rigid on that's having an emotional, a physical effect on the children, then, you know, that's inappropriate. That's abuse. It shouldn't. You know, where they're feeling bad about themselves, or there's any, you know, any physical, you know, discomfort after the initial, like, you know, that's abuse. That's what.
Does this National Commission have oversight of ISKCON's policies and procedures? Do they sort of inspect them to see whether they're up to scratch? Do they provide feedback on them? How do they rate what they've seen?
Yeah, so they do. As part, to be compliant, you have to have a code of conduct. You have to have these policies in place. You have to. And so the only state that's ever requested to see it I've had is Victoria. But the other bodies, I guess, you know, with every organisation, they're sort of struggling to keep up with,
volumes of,
you know, the ideal. You know, we can put all sorts of things in place, but, you know, realistically, logistically, financially, it's not always able to be achieved to the level that they want. So I've only ever had Victoria overlook it, and they were quite happy, and even the international office, we were quite ahead of our time in having that policy put in place. ISKCON, I know, some people, there are concerns there with certain aspects, but the policy that was put in place was quite responsive. When things were brought, to the surface of abuse that was going on, and the policy, the international office CPO operational guidelines and policy is very similar to what the states put in place anyway, which is, a merit to our organisation, because some other organisations are nowhere near at the stage that we're at.
I might switch tack just for a moment. So we've spoken largely about what's in place in Australia. It sounds like there's quite a lot of regulation that provides direction and guidance. Clearly, you have a lot of personal experience in this area. When you hear about the general history of abuse around the world, the impact it's had on ISKCON communities, devotees' lives, and the ways in which leaders have responded, what are your sort of general musings about what the society internationally still needs to do to get to perhaps an idyllic standard?
Yeah, that's we've got a way to go. There's in Australia, I'll just take it back to Australia first and then carry it forward, just as a good example, as leading me to where I think, we need to go is with the National Redress Scheme, which we're, as an organisation, we're in the joining process. We're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the contracts at the moment between ISKCON Australia and the federal government. And one important aspect of the redress scheme is direct personal responses, they call it. And there's, people that have done, the military had a big royal commission about abuse that was taken on years ago, and there's particular specialists that have worked through this and now are working with people through, survivors of abuse, sexual abuse through institutions, through the redress scheme. And they've found that a very effective method is these direct personal responses, where it's not an easy process because different people have different expectations on what would appease them, but what people need, that they've found, is they just need to be heard. They need to be heard and to be understood. And most people, they don't necessarily want money. They don't want all this. What they want is for the institution to hear them and to ensure that what happened to them will never be done again. And they've, this is through a process of thousands of people, thousands of survivors, through the military commission, through this, national redress, through institutional sexual abuse. And that's what they found, that that's the most healing process for the survivors, but also for the organisation, that it's the most effective method with moving forward. So you've got to put in place those things that, things that have happened, then you need to, acknowledge what's happened, take responsibility, apologise for it, and ensure that there's things put in place to make sure that, that either the perpetrator or the process that was lacking, that let that survivor down in the first place, is being rectified.
So just to explore that for a moment. So from whom does that acknowledgement need to come? Is it from the perpetrator? In the absence of a perpetrator, is it from an ISKCON leader or somebody?
What the specialists in these particular programs have found is that a lot of the survivors, if it's in relation to it's happened within an institution, from a perpetrator, it's very confronting. It's very confronting to them. But if it's happened within an institution, they prefer it to come from a senior personality within that, because they're the ones that, have got the power, the influence to
speak
seek
on behalf of the institution. We see
Yeah,
that this happened to you. We're sorry that we
exactly.
weren't able to prevent this. We acknowledge the injury that's happened, and so on.
Exactly. We need to, and a lot of survivors want to see it coming from the top down, not
Yeah.
from the grassroots up. They want to hear from the top that, you know, that there, you know, what's happened was not right, but this is what we're going to do to put things in place. Now that process is a tricky process, and the survivors really need to, and the organisation really need to be supported and primed before having that meeting, because it needs to be realistic. You know, the survivors need to have realistic expectations from the outcome of that meeting, and as do the representatives of the organisation. So when they do that, there's a lot of prepping work before the actual meeting, because it's not a simple thing.
So there's a question that's just come through on chat. A question I have is that some cultures or ethnic groups have parenting styles that may be considered abuse from another culture's perspective. For instance, many cultures are heavily punitive with their children, with the mood that the parent is the authority, whereas from a Western perspective, we're moving towards a more empathic model of parenting. Could you please comment on this? So I think it ties in with what we were saying a couple of minutes back.
Yeah, I guess it does come down to what the law stipulates in the area in which that family, that cultural family, are living in. You know, what might be acceptable, you know, where they've come from, you know, it can get them in trouble if it's not meeting the boundaries of appropriate discipline, or, you know, in that particular state, because we're all accountable to the laws in which we're residing under.
Well, presumably, whatever the custom may be in a particular culture, the impact on the psyche of the individual would be the same.
Yeah.
So just going back to the train of thought, you were talking about the National Redress Scheme, and ISKCON Australia is in the process of signing up. What does that exactly mean? What does it mean to be signed up to the redress scheme?
Yep. So the National Redress Scheme. So what happened, coming from the Royal Commission, they found that you know, organisations, institutions hadn't responded appropriately to survivors of abuse, and so the redress scheme, and this is a good. It's such a blessing in a sense, because it is a very difficult thing to navigate between an organisation. I know it sounds like it should be simple, you know, taking accountability and, you know, supporting the survivor, but there's delicate ground. The institutions, you know, to deal with it has to be dealt with appropriately. And so this national redress has come in and said, okay, the federal government's putting specialists into this scheme that will then, so anyone who's, you know, historically been abused, sexually abused within an organisation and within our organisation, are able to log on to the National Redress Scheme website online, and then they can register that they're wanting to make a claim of redress through the scheme. And so then the government body then acts as a middle ground. So they will, the person, the survivor who's putting in a report wanting to make a claim of redress will have to fill in some details, historical details, which isn't an easy process for survivors, but they do provide a lot of support. They provide free legal advice and counselling services for anyone as they're going through this process, and just in general if they need to access that. And then they give details of the abuse that happened, and then the redress scheme then contact us as an organisation and say, we've received this claim, these are the details, can you give us your information? And then the redress scheme themselves will adjudicate the case and decide on the civil law. Civil law is the balance of probability. So it's not like a court system where it's beyond reasonable doubt. They will view things like we do in the CPO as a balance of probability. Does it sound probable that what the survivor is claiming happened? So then they adjudicate on that, and then they decide whether it's substantiated or unsubstantiated. If it is substantiated, they then allocate a certain amount of funding for funds as to the survivor of the abuse.
A kind of compensation or funding of therapy? Okay.
Yeah.
And they may also provide some kind of therapy or victim support
therapy
or something.
Is provided if they want to. So they get the option.
Right.
Do you want therapy, which the organisation, the institution will pay for as well. So they're not out of pocket in any way at all. So they will get compensation, which is separate. But then if they want, the legal advice is free. So what to do with the money, if they need assistance with what to do with that money that they get, or counselling is through the scheme. They, refer them to counsellors that are specifically trained for trauma and abuse. And we as an organisation cover those costs. And then they're given the third point of, do they want a direct personal response, which means, and this is for the survivor to choose the grounds,
right,
because we don't want to re-victimize the abuser, the abuse survivor in any way. So they can choose what, and then they're guided as well. They're supported with specialists within the scheme, as so it's realistic, so what they might want from it would, there might be someone, they want a letter from someone, or they want to have a face-to-face meeting. And if that face-to-face meeting with, some senior representatives of the organisation, whatever costs are involved with that, the organisation pays for. So even, flying them to Sydney and paying for the accommodation for the meeting. So that's all covered by the organisation as well. But it's their grounds. But then also, too, as I mentioned previously, it's a very, very delicate process. It really needs to be, the organisation representatives need to be supported and work through it, as well as, because you want to make sure that the institution representatives respond appropriately. You don't want to turn around going, well, I never experienced that. That's,
of course, that would do more harm than good.
More harm than good. So everyone has to be primed and ready to have this meeting that is beneficial for the survivor, and that they can get out of it, so survivors that are from Indigenous culture might say, I'd like to have it in country. I'd like to go out and have it to a space that's, significant for us. Yeah. So, it can be as, or a tree planted somewhere in, in memory and recognition of. It's, it can be creative. It can be, what the survivor needs to find that peace. And what they've found is that some of them go into these meetings and they might have their family come in, and the family have never heard them, the survivor speak of the abuse before. So it's actually quite a phenomenal experience for the survivor and for the family. So it's a very powerful process in healing, past.
But as you say, it needs to be very carefully handled so that it actually has the positive impact as opposed to worsens things. So you mentioned in your introduction that you've worked in a number of sort of social work type environments.
Yeah.
Relative to other environments, how would you rate ISKCON's maturity in terms of dealing with this kind of stuff? Are we pretty average? Are we worse than average? Are we better than average?
Yeah. Look, everything is, when you've got big organizations comes bureaucracy, and bureaucracy makes things so slow, and I don't believe that the leaders, of our organization are just looking after themselves, or, I really believe that, there is interest, and there is, of wanting to deal with things correctly. We're not, as I said before, with our policy, we're quite ahead of other organisations. We're not as well organised or funded as, say, like a Catholic church or something like that. But, we're getting there. I think, we're above average. We're definitely above average. And I think there's genuine, as an institution, there's genuine you know, concern and interest in child safety, but the details are still yet to be, you know, to really work out, because it's difficult saying international, but yet all around the world you've got, you know, different laws. You know, temples are under different jurisdictions and different responses. So, you know, where we're situated in Australia would be much more responsive than somewhere, you know, than some other countries. And then you've got, you know, in a movement where we're quite, you know, we're moving around, and you know, so different people could be just, you know, traveling around in different jurisdictions all the time. And how do you, you know, like we've got, you know, just a few little more things I think to work on, but it definitely comes with you know, education, and you know, because education and awareness will help with the cultural change. Yeah,
So,
that's my opinion.
So I asked that question earlier, and then we sort of went off in a slightly different direction for a while. I mentioned sort of international. So you started talking a little bit about Australia, but as a prelude to talking about international, was there anything else you wanted to say about how you view? And I suppose I'm looking at the history of child protection across ISKCON. So probably it was in the 90s at some time that the CPO was first formed. And different devotees may have different impressions depending on their where they live in the world about how effectively CPO has acted, or to what extent its findings are taken seriously by ISKCON's leaders. So just any general thoughts on this when you think of it from a global perspective?
Yeah, I think, yeah, on a global perspective, I don't, you know, it's not so easy, but I think tend to be, you know, the child protection office is putting, you know, its processes, you know, are good, and I think, you know, it's just, it can be fine-tuned to be a bit more responsive. You know, it's underfunded, it's undermanned, you know, it's the challenges of being a volunteer organization. You know, there's that, you know, and sometimes when it comes into from adjudication, excuse me, and decisions when they're coming internally might not necessarily be, you know, when it comes from an external body, people seem to sit up and go, oh, okay, now we really need to get on top of this. So, you know, like how you'd like to see it develop, you know, it's not a simple solution, but I think, yeah, it definitely more resources, you know, and we're always going to have the challenge of, it is, I mean, as the institution and as the congregations grow, we're getting more and more people with professional experience and professional, which is fantastic. We need to utilize that. You know, we've got some really well qualified people out there, you know, that just, you know, tapping into that and doing that, I think we'll see going into the future, you know, a more fluid and responsive and, you know, I believe approach when, you know, as we grow and we've got more people with the actual training and experience to deal with such things.
There's 4 areas or themes that I think have been touched on a lot in the Vedic Inquirer thread. There's prevention, which you've spoken quite a bit about. There's the operations of CPO itself, so including things like its funding, but as you say, its staffing, and then its investigatory procedures and those kind of things. Then I'll mention the 4th one before I mention the 3rd one, victim support, so the response of the community and how well we help, I suppose, rehabilitate survivors to have a life that, you know, is at least with reduced impact, severe impact. The big one that seems to still create a lot of concern is how leaders respond. It sounds like you're having reasonable support from Australian ISKCON leaders, but if we think about globally, whether there's denial sometimes, this person that I know that's now being accused couldn't possibly have done that, possibly even some intervention within investigations, or seeking reduce the restrictions, or sometimes just ignoring the restrictions. How do you think we crack that? How do you think, as a society, because this is obviously not unique to ISKCON, this is the very thing that the Catholic Church often stands being accused of, and possibly other religious organizations. How do we break the back of this denial culture, or circling the wagons, or whatever you want to call it?
I wish I knew. There's a particular, more of a challenge within religious organizations, because we place a lot more than, say, other institutions like, sporting clubs or other things like that, because we place a lot of trust in certain personalities within our organization, because we believe that, that's a good standing person, that it would never happen. And if that personality gives particular attention to my child, wow, how fortunate is my child? Like we that's just common knowledge with, religious organizations. There's a trickier aspect to it, because we do place a lot of extra trust and, space for certain individuals within our organization. I think, there's a lot of the leaders want to find a balance between accepting the responsibility, but then there's concern with the movement must go on, onwards and upwards, and the preaching must go on, and so it's striking that balance. I mean, I don't know the solution at this point. I think it has obviously comes down to cultural change. How that happens, I don't know, because we need to, just be more, I think it needs to, on all levels, be more in the conscious, in the conscious mind of everything that we do. And this is what, the governing bodies, really emphasize with the work that I've been doing, that it needs to be in every aspect of the organization from the very top. Everything we do needs to think, now, is that, safe for the children? Is that, is that going to mitigate some risk, or is that, and so then, it comes down to personalities as well. Sure, that there might be, they're great preachers and they come with, awe and reverence, but, we have to mitigate risk. Like what is better for the organization? Having a preacher that's, a real potential, is a known risk continuing on, or the risk of the well-being and safety of the children. It has to come with some cultural change, but I can't give you the solution for that, because it's something I still ponder as well, exactly how to effectively do that, and how far is, being in my role, is it my space to really say.
No, and it's a challenge, isn't it, to think about how to tackle this on a global level. To your knowledge, has there ever been any sort of awareness training for that highest level of leadership? So you've talked about awareness training at site, a gurukul or a temple or whatever. But what about that kind of awareness training with the leaders themselves, the GBCs or whatever? Has anything ever been done at that level, to your knowledge?
I don't know. I mean, with my training in Australia, all the TPs have to come. They all have, they're all being trained and aware of what the requirements are, what constitutes child abuse, what indicators. So they have all, sat through training, say what, abuse is, what does it look like, how to pick it up, how to respond and report to it. But beyond, our borders, I don't know.
You've got no jurisdiction, obviously. No, it was just a point of view. I'm mindful that we're zeroing in on the hour, and that's probably about the right sort of length of these things. Maybe one last question from my side, and then any final words that you have.
Yeah.
So there's lots of devotees who are following these conversations and issues. Vedic Inquiry is only one of several sites on Facebook or whatever these kind of things are being discussed. What can the average individual devotee who's simply concerned about these matters do to help raise the game? I mean, we've talked about funding. Are there other things that people can practically do? Is it writing some kind of petition, or I mean, what recommendations would you have? Just
the
the average devotee that's concerned, that's following along. They may or may not have children of their own, but they're just concerned that society does still need to somehow lift its game. What can they do?
Yeah, I think just, become more actively involved. You can contact the CPTs, get an understanding of what our policies and procedures are, and doing exactly what you're doing, create dialogue, become more aware, and bring it from, especially, with certain cultures, there's taboo, serious taboo around these topics. We don't talk about that, they don't want to talk about, they don't want to know, but bringing it forward and having everyone making it part of our everyday psyche as a community. Because if we start, at home and the local community, from it become with awareness and support, and Damodar Pundit, touched on that as well, that it's really powerful if you do it from your local and become aware, become knowledge yourself. The policies are available in the receptions at every temple. You can get a copy if you want, get familiar with it, open the dialogue with others, and then, from a global, I guess, that's challenging. I think, I don't know what the solution for that one is, but, it definitely needs to be, if there's more, from the grassroots, there's more, like this option, this wonderful avenue you've created where there's mature, open, dialogue to discuss this, then we can then take it. If there's pressure from the bottom, the grassroots coming up saying we want accountability here, then the leaders will listen. But it's got to be mature, it's got to be rational, it's got to be, if it's really reactive, it's not going to be. You want to have an educated discussion about these things. So, and then, if that movement swells, then, the top will be more responsive, I believe.
Well, Atulya ji, thank you very much for making the time to join us and explaining things. And even more, thank you so much for taking the responsibility to progress this agenda. And I apologize, obviously, that we had a few interruptions just in terms of capturing the conversation. Hopefully, we've recorded at least 95% of it. We may have lost a little bit of bits and pieces. But yeah, massive thank you. And let's see what conversation this prompts. I believe Dhira Govinda Prabhu may well be able to join us soon. I think he ran CPO internationally for quite a while and is very senior. Okay, Hare Krishna. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and please, wishing you all success in your service. Hare Bol.
Thank you, and you. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Bol.